Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our DAT IQ weekly market update. This is our last update for September, the last update for the quarter. It's September 27th, 2022. I'm Ken Adamo over here at DAT. I'm Chief of Analytics. I'm joined today by Alex Perry, who's head of our professional services team. He's filling in for Dean, who's on assignment in Chicago this week. But we're going to hold down the fort for y'all this week. How you doing, Alex?
Pretty good, Ken. How are you?
Fresh off a beating of those Badgers over the weekend. Ohio State took care of business. It was a blackout. It was a pretty good night. Able to head for the exits a little early. It was a good time. How was your weekend?
Great. My father-in-law had his birthday. We went out to wine country here in Oregon and had some wine and cake.
Oh, that is fun. Yeah, I had a great vintage of White Claw at the game. It was black cherry with hints of
chef's kiss.
Aspartame. Yeah, aspartame. Yeah, it's actually my son's birthday today. My middle son is 4 years old. Harrison turned 4 today. He's sitting right over here by me. He got to come into the office today, so he's all excited. So here we are. Every week we join you all to talk about what we're seeing in the freight market, look at some data, some forecasts, but most importantly, answer your questions. There's a lot going on this week. Especially weather-wise, so I suspect we'll have a lot of questions. Go ahead and get those in early so we can sift through them and get to them at the end of the show. But with that, I'm going to get us to the key points for the week, which are line haul spot rates still tracking closely with 2018 levels, getting a bit of a bump there in dry van, which I'm sure Alex will talk about. Ian is heading towards the Gulf Coast. That's obviously the big story. We're going to cover that later. But we hope that everyone is staying safe, that is they're heeding government advice with their preparations and evacuations. That's going to be a big deal. We know that the Canadian maritime areas got hit pretty hard by Fiona. I got a report from Dean this morning from some truckers in the area that there's some pretty significant damage up there. So our thoughts are with those folks. ATA tonnage index up 2.8% month over month and about 4% year over year. Housing construction rebounds, single housing family starts up 3.4%. After declining months since March, multifamily units up 28%. And then used truck prices down considerably, but still up over pre-pandemic levels. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to walk us through our market update. Alex?
Though absent, Dean has provided a wealth of information for us, and I'll kind of go over some of that today. We'll start with the dry van load to truck ratios. Dry van load posts were flat this week, tracking around 35% lower than previous year, but 22% higher than 2018, when freight demand was strong and capacity tight. Truck posts were also flat last week, but 11% higher year over year and 25% more than the same week in 2018. As a result, the dry van load to truck ratio increased by less than 1% from 3.6 to 3.63. Moving on to the reefer load to truck ratios. Reefer load post decreased 6% last week, 44% lower than previous year. Produce national season volumes are lower by almost 10% compared to the end of September last week, contributing to the lower spot market volumes than the previous week. Carrier equipment posts are still at their highest levels in the last 6 years, and even 13% higher than in 2019 when capacity was really loose. As a result, the reefer load to truck ratio decreased slightly by just over 3% from 6.54 to 6.34. The flatbed load to truck ratio continues to track seasonally with pre-pandemic years, except for 2017, which is that yellow line, when Category 5 hurricanes Irma and Maria made landfall in September. Such is the impact of hurricane season on the flatbed market, for sure. Load posts are around 64% lower than the previous year and 10% lower than 2018, which was an excellent year for flatbed carriers. Flatbed equipment posts were flat last week, and along with 4% fewer load posts, and the load to truck ratio decreased 4% week over week from 13.0 to 12.57. Excuse me. Van MCI market conditions. The load posts and DAT's top 10 freight markets representing around 26% of total load posts, increased by 2% last week, reversing the top 10 3-week spot rate decline. Dry van line haul rates increased slightly, rising by a penny a mile to a top 10 average of $2 per mile. Notable market movers include Los Angeles and Chicago, where spot rates increased by 3 cents a mile to an outbound average of $2.09 per mile and $2.23 respectively. On the 2,000-mile long-haul lane from LA to Chicago, spot rates increased to $1.78 per mile last week, which is 11 cents per mile higher than the August average, but almost $1 lower than the previous year. In Chicago, where load posts were up by almost 2% last week, spot rates for loads to Atlanta have risen by nearly 40 cents a mile since June, averaging $2.40 a mile versus over the previous week. In contrast, loads 760 miles east to Philadelphia have been flat at $2.37 per mile for the last 4 months. In South Texas, outbound dry van capacity tightened for the third week in McAllen, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston markets, following last week's increase of a penny per mile to $1.84 per mile. Loads moved between Houston and Dallas increased by 6% last week, although dry van capacity is the loosest in 12 months, with loads paying $165 per load less than the previous year at $560 a load last week. This lane has been reasonably balanced from a volume perspective for over a year, with spot rates in the opposite direction from Dallas to Houston following the same northbound trend. Round trip rates are still averaging $2.24 per mile, or 36 cents a mile higher than the national average. On to Reefer. The load posts in DAT's top 10 reefer freight markets, representing 23% of total load posts, increased by 13% last week, which was insufficient to impact outbound capacity significantly. Spot rates in the top 10 markets remained flat last week at $2.27 per mile. In Elizabeth, New Jersey, the number one load post market, spot rates increased by a penny per mile to an outbound average of $1.87 last week. Still, on the southbound lane to Atlanta, line haul rates dropped 2 cents per mile below the August average to $2.14 per mile versus over the previous week. Rates on this lane are almost 80 cents a mile lower than last year. Loads west to Chicago followed a similar trend at $1.64 per mile last week, or almost 70 cents a mile lower than the previous year. After decreasing for the prior 2 weeks, outbound spot rates in Atlanta increased by 2 cents a mile last week to an average of $2.04 per mile. In contrast, rates dropped around the number one volume lane to Lakeland, Florida, where rates averaged $3.08 per mile last week, which is 20 cents per mile lower than August and $1.20 per mile lower than the previous year. After decreasing for the prior 3 weeks, outbound spot rates in Fresno, California, the largest produce market in California, rates increased by a penny per mile to $2.14 per mile last week. Spot rates for loads 600 miles east to Phoenix were down slightly at $3.20 per mile and just over $1 per mile lower than the previous year. In the Pacific Northwest, reefer capacity tightened for the third week, with spot rates increasing from 3 cents a mile to an average regional outbound rate of $2.02 per mile. Spot rates in the largest Pacific Northwest market in Pendleton, Oregon, increased by 5 cents a mile to $2.10 per mile, while loads to Phoenix were flat at $2.04 per mile, but up substantially on the 1,200-mile route to Los Angeles. Rates on this lane at $1.86 per mile are around 13 cents per mile higher than the previous year, after increasing by 70 cents a mile since the start of June. In Flatbed, Houston's the number one flatbed market, outbound capacity continued to loosen for the fourth week following last week's 3 cents per mile decrease to $2.57 per mile. The volume of loads being moved between Houston and Fort Worth increased by just over 13% last week, which was insufficient to reverse the downward trend in spot rates at $3.42 per mile the previous week. That is 54 cents per mile lower than the peak in May this year, but 20 cents a mile higher than last year. On the number 2 outbound lane to El Paso from Houston, loads moved were 9% up week over week, with rates following a similar 3-month trend down. Excuse me, I said up, but they're down 9%, with rates going down to $2.95 per mile last week. In the 2 largest outbound flatbed markets in the Pacific Northwest, loads posted surged in Medford and Portland markets, almost doubling last week. Capacity was very tight in Medford, where spot rates increased by 13 cents a mile to $2.86 per mile, while in the much larger Portland market, capacity loosened as spot rates dropped by 10 cents per mile to $2.38 per mile. Outbound flatbed capacity was tight in Florida last week ahead of this week's much anticipated arrival of Hurricane Ian, the first major hurricane in that state since 2018 with Hurricane Michael. We'll report more on the freight market impact of Ian next week or thereafter. I think we're off next week. Dry van spot rates year over year. There was very little change in last week's dry van spot rate after decreasing by 7 cents a mile in the previous month to a national average of $1.86 per mile. Compared to the top 50 dry van lanes, which averaged $2.24 per mile last week, the national average was 38 cents a mile lower. Like Reefer line haul rates, dry van is still 20 cents a mile higher than the average of pre-pandemic years. Over in Reefer, last week's Reefer line haul rate decreased just under 3 cents a mile at $2.18, 25% or 71 cents per mile lower than the previous year. Reefer spot rates have decreased by 31% or almost $1 per mile since the start of the year, leaving the Reefer line haul rate just 1 cent per mile lower than in 2018. However, last week's average spot rate is still 20 cents a mile higher than the pre-pandemic average for the 3rd week of September. And over in flatbed, after dropping by 49 cents a mile since the start of the year and 47 cents per mile since the beginning of June, flatbed line haul spot rates flattened out last week, remaining unchanged at $2.18 per mile. Compared to the previous year, spot rates are 52 cents per mile lower and just a penny lower than in 2018. And that's it for this week's market update. If you want to find out more about what's happening in freight, go to dat.com/market update and download our weekly report. And with that, it's over to Ken for the short-term forecast.
So we are going to talk about forecasts here. I'm just looking over here to make sure. I think we need to adjust our slides for a second. So we need to get back to the forecast ones. So the heading should be National Spot Rate Dry Van Actuals with Forecast. If we could just, there we go. All right, cool. So we, just to level set on what this chart is, the blue line is a historical weighted rolling 7-day weighted average per mile, excluding fuel. This first one is for dry van. And then we have some forecasts. The green one is RateCast, which is our flagship forecasting model. The red line is a short-term forecasting model, which more heavily weights recent data. And then the gray and yellow are blends of the two. I've been talking for many weeks now, pretty much since Ned left, that RateCast was just flushed with optimism that we were going to get back to a seasonal shipping cycle. And the short-term forecast was just being the kind of Debbie Downer in the room, or the Donnie Downer. RateCast is growing ever the less optimistic about what the next month or so has in store. Still expecting things to hold. And again, this is a national forecast. This would look completely different if we were talking about some of the weather-impacted areas or some of the more direct shipping, retail shipping and warehousing areas. But so RateCast is expecting a little bit of a bump and then a bit of a slide. Then what's really interesting about how peak typically manifests is you see that kind of first mile bump, which happens right about now. And then you do see a bit of a lull through most of October before things really pick up heading into November and Black Friday. What's interesting, Amazon just announced a Prime Day. What they tend to do with Prime Days is avoid major shipping congestion. So I think the normal Prime Day is usually in July when things post 4th of July, things are pretty slow. I think the new one's announced for sometime in mid-October, again, well ahead of Black Friday, where they're not competing for congestion on lanes. Let's move to refrigerated really quick here. Very similar story, nothing kind of crazy here. Basically, the short-term forecast is much more pessimistic. Raycast, again, expecting a bump and then a bit of a backslide. And again, I think part of this is less optimism in the Raycast model, but then it's also part of it is seeing further ahead in the future into that typical gully we see seasonally heading into the pre-Black Friday run-up. And then let's just go to Flatbed. Pretty much in alignment here as the forecasts have been, that things are going to remain slow. Again, I stress this is a national forecast. If we are unfortunate and do receive a lot of property damage from the storm, you will see the Southeast really ramp up from a Flatbed perspective in support of rebuilding and reconstruction efforts. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up on the data portion of this week's show and move us to our question of the week. Our question of the week is, what impact will Hurricane Ian have on the southeastern freight markets? So this is obviously the big story right now. I seem to have lost my companion, Mr. Perry. I'm hoping he'll be back here shortly, but this is the big story, and we've been tracking the storm for a little while now. Ian seems to be setting its sights on Tampa, the greater Tampa area. And for us, that's the Lakeland market. So what we wanted to do was study what potential impacts we could see. So we obviously know that we never want a weather event to harm property or people. That's not what we want to have happen. But we know that tropical season comes every year, and this is something we need to be prepared for. So I think we have a chart, perhaps, that's going to show what Houston. There we go. So Houston in 2017 had Hurricane Harvey, right, which was like a 200-year storm that parked itself and dumped 60-some inches of rain in the greater Houston area and caused a lot of flooding. A lot of the forecast discussion with this storm centers around it being a rain event, more and more over the last couple hours, a wind event as well, potentially parking over the greater Tampa Bay area for a day or so. So what I wanted to do was illustrate what happened in Houston in the period surrounding Harvey. Because there's a really common misconception that weather events really impact the outbound. It's really not so much the case. Mm-hmm. What we see in Houston, which is typically a very balanced market, is that, of course, there was an impact on the outbound, right? There was a short-term blip, but things normalized within a week or so, a couple weeks. What we really saw was a major impact on the inbound, which makes a ton of sense, right? You see a little bit less outbound freight, so the market becomes inherently imbalanced. So you're rushing to get materials in there, whether it's the initial recovery supplies like bottled water, medical supplies, et cetera, and then the building and construction supplies to rebuild. So as you can see, there was a pretty monumental shift there between inbound and outbound that persisted, and this chart only goes for a few months after the hurricane, but it really persisted through the end of the year. Let's kind of flip forward to, not on the screen, but in general to Lakeland for a second. That's a market that's very imbalanced. I think Lakeland on the outbound side is maybe like a top 20-ish market. It's a top 5 market on the inbound side, right? So there's a ton more freight coming in than going out, even in a normal week, right? When you have a major hurricane bearing down, that can throw things really out of balance. So I would expect most capacities getting out of there right now. I know that FEMA is staging loads at some military installations outside of the direct impact of the storm. But I would expect, if things go as forecasted, the demand for freight into that area to be significantly higher over the next few weeks. And with it will come higher rates. But what do you think, Alex?
Yeah, because of a lot of the points you've said before, the hurricane season comes every year, and folks down in Florida are kind of unfortunately well versed in this kind of thing. That we will see impacts for the Florida market to be sure. But a big difference with the Houston market is I think we see larger impacts to the broader freight network. So lanes that are unrelated to specifically Houston being impacted. Whereas with Florida is very Florida specific. And so impacts in Florida and then the broader market probably will be less impacted, I think. We saw that with Michael, Irma, and Hermine. These are all different storms, all hitting different places. But Hurricane Irma came, if folks remember, 1 month later, exactly a month later than Harvey in Florida, and there was much less impact. It was a smaller storm by the time it made landfall, but we'll see. We'll see.
There's a lot of fuel impact. Right? Houston's a huge energy port, right? I mean, that's kind of a big DOT deal when you think about how a lot of the offshore and onshore delivery and refining capacity was impacted by Harvey, a major flooding event. So I tend to agree with you that impact will be less widespread. I think the question is how much capacity does it drain from? I mean, there's some big markets, right? The supply chain has been really in flux these last couple quarters, right? We've seen, I think, Dean will kill me if I get this wrong, but I think New York just in the very recent narrow time frame past LA, Long Beach is the most busy domestic port, and that's just evidence of that shift from west to east of port capacity. With that shift comes increased trucking capacity needed, right, to handle that. So you have Savannah, Charleston, up to New York. How much will the need for inbound recovery and basically just even backlogged freight into Florida pull away or even drive rates up for some of that inland and drayage capacity for those East Coast port moves? I mean, I think that's something to consider. Atlanta is obviously a big market. Could this throw Atlanta out of balance, right? Houston, you're really pretty much just stealing from Dallas at that point. I guess maybe Oklahoma City or Kansas City, but you're really stealing from Dallas. So here you're stealing from a top 5 freight market in Atlanta that's typically balanced. So if I'm a major carrier that has exposure in the Atlanta market, this is something I'm watching closely because some of that capacity might look at lucrative options to go into Florida once the storm hits for a few weeks and may not handle freight outbound from Atlanta to other destinations. So it's just something to think about. It's not that far of a drive. And I think it's definitely within reason that Atlanta could be impacted by this.
And we'll absolutely be watching it as it develops. And we have a lot of kind of data and visualizations prepped and ready to go to monitor these impacts in the days and weeks to follow.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to believe that our friends in the freight tabloid industry didn't see this coming months ago with all of their high frequency data, right? I mean, it's shocking if I'm being quite honest. But
for sure.
I'll leave it up to all of you if our data is high frequency enough, but we are tracking it down to the hour, right? And before we joined, Alex and I were talking about looking at load board activity on an hourly basis to see if we can start to figure out when trends are going to shift in those Florida markets. To kind of, and again, part of it's intellectual and academic curiosity that we have as kind of data nerds, but then also it's alerting our customers and partners on what's happening in the market, right? That's really the primary source, the reason we're sourcing a lot of this data, and I think it's super interesting.
Absolutely.
So what else can we think about here, Alex?
Do we have any questions? I got cut for a moment.
Yeah, I'm sure we do.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if we had any.
We've got a couple shout outs to go through, but
I don't see. So Amanda B says we are still seeing the effects of COVID all across the supply chain process. Then added complications from weather conditions and the perfect storm. No pun intended. I think it's a really good observation. I think the supply chain is hardening itself again, but is still in a more fragile state than it was pre-pandemic. I think we saw that with the buildup of anxiety around the potential rail strike, right? Thankfully for the supply chain, that didn't come to fruition. And I think you're seeing it here, right? It's like cautiously optimistic that the supply chain will be able to metabolize this storm and get us into peak without much of a problem. But again, I think everyone's a bit snake bit over what's happened the last 2.5 years. Gary Bates, how many brokers are going out of business? I can't imagine very many. So we are seeing that this is a very lucrative market for brokers, right? With the only real exception being brokers tied to specific markets that have slowed down, or brokers that must maintain volume levels to survive, which again, those are fewer and far between. If you're a broker that has great relationships or even frankly mediocre relationships, you're seeing ample margins and still ample volume. So I would suspect that there's not much pressure to push brokers out of business at the moment. Alex, thoughts on that?
With the softening spot market, we may see something in the future, but yeah, it's pretty early. It's something we watch at a high level, and we haven't heard too many alarm bells yet. So yeah, I think as far as how many exactly, I don't know that anybody can know that exactly, but yeah, we're watching it, and we'll see. We'll see how this market cycle develops, and yeah, as always, report out.
Yeah, we will. And I think, frankly, the pressure's been with carriers, right? I mean, small carriers have faced the brunt of the margin pressure over the last, well, small carriers and some large carriers as well. But
for sure. Yeah, that's
fuel.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. The softening market is an opportunity for margin expansion in the kind of short term, but it does require some ongoing maintenance and reevaluation, right? As those prices continue to fall, we'll see and how the market reacts to that. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think it's been a welcome change in fuel prices, which has been good, right? EIA was down, I think, 7.5 cents last night. We're now down to I think we have prices we haven't seen since March. Diesel futures have been getting hammered. Hopefully they don't sort of get upended at anything with the storm. But I think as we continue to see fuel prices come down, again, we're still at 2018 pricing levels. I think again, not to harp too much and get too cheeky, but there's this kind of this recency bias where freight data didn't exist before 2019, right? So I mean, that's just really not true, right? I mean, we're hovering at, when I was in the industry, 2018 was a time period we never thought we'd see again. It was like the gilded roads, it was like you couldn't turn around without picking up bundles of cash based on high rates and high volumes. And while rates are trending there, I think we'll be all right. We're certainly not at 2019 levels, or what was it, 2016 levels, the last kind of real dip. So, rates are at 2018 levels. Fuel is certainly a lot higher. There's no mistake there. And operating costs are higher. Let's not pretend that inflation doesn't exist like the Fed. And then when you think about it, if we can get some relief in fuel, we should see, maybe not as much as in years prior, but we should see some seasonal uptick due to peak. Get through that slow period in late January through February, and then I'm hopeful that spring next year will bring with it some improvement in these conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think that probably feels right. Data backs it up.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions here? Let's take a peek. Vidax says the market is fluctuating. That's a mouthful right there. Alan Johnson says we're still thanking every truck driver for what they do. I could not possibly agree with that more. We're coming off National Truck Driver Appreciation Week. We all know that one of the biggest mobilization forces after a major natural disaster are the truckers. Perhaps don't get enough attention, right? But they should, bringing much needed supplies, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and all of that into affected areas. So we tip our hat to them all day, every day, and thank them for what they do. I think that's all I have this week.
Great.
All right, I'm going to move on to... Go ahead.
A couple shout outs.
Yeah, I mean, the big one is we're not going to be here next week because we're all going to be in Austin, Texas for DATCon 2022. The theme of that show will be Exceed. We're going to have a ton of great speakers. I'm beyond excited for it. My biggest challenge at this moment is figuring out who to send to who with dinner for dinner, right? Because I want to have dinner with everyone. But I can only be so many places and eat so much food. But we're going to be in Austin next Wednesday through Friday. Wednesdays are shipper day. Thursday and Fridays are kind of general sessions. I think we're over our target for how many people we were hoping to get there. I think registration's still open if you're interested in joining. We would love to have you. It's going to be a great event. We have Scary Terry Bradshaw joining us on Friday to give a great keynote speech. But you're going to have breakout sessions. What are your sessions on, Alex?
My sessions are on digging deeper into rate view data and rates data to kind of take those next steps with your analytics. Got another member of the team talking about market conditions index as well. It'll be great.
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing pretty much your entire team down there. So if you have any data questions, anyone who's already planning on joining, I would make sure that you find Alex or someone on his team and have a chat. They'll be there. We'll have a booth or several booths, I imagine, with people doing product training and demos. It's going to be a really fun time, and I'm looking forward to it. Great barbecue, as I've mentioned, pretty much every show leading up to DATCon, because that's all I really think about. Dean is at, I believe it's the JOC Inland Conference this week. That's where he's at. He's speaking, in Chicago.
Yeah, and tomorrow he'll be on Sales Chatter show with Dan Deegan and DJ Flores at 9 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, and then you can connect with them on LinkedIn. He'll also be on Landline Now at 7 p.m. Eastern tomorrow night on Road Dog Radio on Sirius XM channel 146.
Yeah, I'm very thankful we have Dean on our team. He's like, it's like, where in the world is Dean Croak, right? He's always out there. He's very in demand, right? I mean, when you have someone with that deep of a knowledge of the freight markets and what's going on, pretty much everyone wants to talk to Dean, and for good reason. So with that, we're going to sign off. We won't see you again until after DATCon. So if you want to see us next week, that's the best place to find us. Dean's market report is available on our website, so I recommend you check that out if you're interested. And I want to thank Alex for filling in these past couple weeks. He's been a great partner to share the show with, and we're going to sign off and get ready for Austin. Goodbye, everyone, and stay safe down there if you're in the path of the storm.
Indeed. Have a good one.